Arizonans could turn the state's electoral system upside down in this fall's election. Would that be a good thing?
This initiative subverts democracy, and that's why we're against Proposition 121.
Well, you don't have to run a poll to understand that there is a huge amount of dissatisfaction with the public in terms of how the existing partisan system works.
Tonight on Arizona Week, what an open primary election system could do to and for the state if voters approve.
Production of Arizona Week is made possible in parts by a grant from the Stonewall Foundation and by the members of Arizona Public Media. Thank you for your continued support. Once again, your moderator, Michael Chiha.
Proposition 121 is known as the open primary or top two system, aimed at moderating state politics by reducing political party control in primary elections. Tonight, the pros and the cons. But first, an analysis of the proposition from Senior Research Fellow David Berman of Arizona State University's Morrison Institute for Public Policy. Tell us what Proposition 121 will do. How will it change the system?
What the top two system wants to do is have one primary, where all the candidates, all the voters participate, regardless of party. It's somewhat comparable to nonpartisan elections that we find on the local level, with the exception of Tucson, where the partisanship is no longer the most salient thing. What the top two tries to do is to impose or bring about a winnowing system where you just eliminate candidates in the primary and wind up with the top two vote getters, regardless of party, who face each other in the general election.
Now, do you think that that will make elections more competitive in Arizona?
Well, it'll make the primaries more competitive, certainly. Everybody, all the candidates, rather than people separating out by party, all the candidates will be in one primary, so that you'll have an awful lot of choice, and you'll be in the same. You'll get to vote in that primary, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, and you'll get your choice of all the candidates. So that would be a lot more competitive. Of course, when you get to the general election and you winnow it down to the two people, then there are probably fewer candidates in the general election than you have now. Third parties would probably have a tough time getting through the primary to put their candidates on the ballot to be one of those top two.
Now, the proponents of this measure say that independent voters are currently pretty much left out of the system and that this will help draw them in. Is that true? Do you see that in your analysis?
Well, I think yes. I think you find that they are pretty much left out of the process, and that you probably will encourage their participation, particularly in the primaries. They're left out of the process because I think many of them in Arizona, even though they have an opportunity to vote in the primary of their choice, don't take advantage of that primary. Or that opportunity. But what they do under the top two system would be voting in a primary that's open to everybody. It wouldn't be somebody else's primary. It would be open to everyone. And I think that would encourage them, and I think there's some evidence to suggest that that would encourage them to get more involved as voters. And they would have more choice, too.
Now, you said evidence that they might get more involved.
Yeah.
And some of the evidence you cite in the analysis you did is from the state of Washington, which has now had this system in place for 2 or 3 election cycles. What did you find there?
Well, it's hard to come up with definite conclusions on that. In some of the elections, the rate of participation did increase. I don't know, though, by breaking it down, whether I'll find out that it was somebody else besides independents who actually were more involved. And there have been other elections under the top two system in Washington with the primary where participation was actually lower. I think in California, too, the participation was not as high as people expected in the California primary just held under the top two system in June. But there's so many things that can affect turnout other than the top two system. The candidates, the issues, national trends, a lot of things that determine whether people are going to vote or not.
Whether this system goes into place or not, what political realities are there that will remain in our system?
Well, I think some people argue that, and there is some reason to say this, that the whole proposition is sort of anti-political party, and that it will have a depressing effect on political parties. That's the theme. And I think you can say that the parties are not going to be destroyed by the system. They're going to stick around, and to some extent they're going to game the system. They're going to figure out how to work it. But in a way, and the system itself does not totally eliminate partisanship, because you have, as a candidate, the ability to identify your party registration and the ticket and on all election material. So people have an idea who's Republican and who's a Democrat. So I don't see the political reality is that the change could be very modest. It might encourage people to vote for the more moderate candidate in districts where you have two candidates from the same party. The chances are you probably will get the most moderate candidate elected, because you'll have independents and people from the other party making that choice, as well as the regular party members, and they're likely to skew it. You know, if you have a Republican who is more moderate than another Republican, the Democrats are probably going to vote for that moderate Republican, as would the independents. So that would add a sort of a moderating effect.
So is that moderating effect a good thing in a state that has a reputation of being so conservative?
I think conservative liberal, it's really extremist. That the people who are concerned about who are behind the top two ticket, top two idea. The idea is that we just have two ideologically extreme people in office, frankly, and that we can get to more moderate candidates by forcing a top two with a top two system, which maybe 10 to 20% of the time will involve giving people a choice between two members of the same political party. And when you do that, then chances are, and I think there's some reason to believe that it would have a moderating effect. But that's marginal. I mean, we're talking about 10% of the seats.
Now, the arguments for and against Proposition 121. Paul Johnson, former mayor of Phoenix and chair of the Open Government Committee, and Clint Bolick, vice president for litigation at the Goldwater Institute. Thanks for being with me.
Great to be with you.
Mr. Johnson, why does Arizona need to change its primary election system?
Well, you don't have to run a poll to understand that there is a huge amount of dissatisfaction with the public in terms of how the existing partisan system works. There's a real sense that today, at the partisan level, people are really more concerned about the red team, the blue team, what party they're in, than the issues that affect both our country as well as our state. What the open primary does is really pretty simple. It opens up the election, so every voter can vote for every candidate in every election, just like we do at city levels. Second, it creates competition, which really doesn't exist today. It doesn't exist today because we've gerrymandered these districts to the point where 26 out of 30 of the districts are safe districts. There is no real competition in the general election. Voters don't get a vote on it. I'm a huge believer that competition works, that when voters have a choice, that it makes a difference in terms of the outcomes. And the third reason is because competition's become a dirty word in politics. The willingness for candidates to work together, to cross the aisle, is becoming increasingly in short supply. And that's because the people that they're having to go back to campaign to are only those people who vote in a partisan primary, where they just simply are more extreme than the general public numbers. When candidates are given an incentive to cross the aisle, meaning when they go back to their election, they know that they're going to have to talk to people in the other party and to independents, it helps create an environment where they will cross the aisle more. And again, all you have to do to know that that works is look at how city governments work.
Mr. Bolick, why is it a bad idea?
Well, it takes a bad system and makes it much, much worse. What Mr. Johnson doesn't talk about is that the result of this system is that you only get a choice of two candidates in November. I'm one of the independents that this campaign supposedly is trying to help. When I go to my ballot in November, I like to pick some Republicans, some Democrats, possibly some Libertarians. This will wipe out third parties. It will wipe out independents from the November ballot. And in many instances, as we've seen in states where this system exists, including California, you'll get a choice between two Democrats or two Republicans. That's not a choice at all. This initiative subverts democracy, and that's why we're against Proposition 121.
Mr. Johnson, what about those independent voters like Mr. Bolick? Does this help them?
Oh, overwhelmingly it helps independent voters. I'm an independent. Today, if you decide to run for office, just as an example, and you're an independent, the two parties get huge advantages over them. They get more money out of the clean election system, which I'm not a supporter of, but the voters are. They have a significantly higher, a 5 times higher amount of signatures that they have to submit to be able to run. They can't get a voting list for free like the people who are in the two parties can. And if you're a voter who's an independent, you don't even really get an early ballot. There's an early ballot list that goes out to primary voters. But of course, if you're an independent, you don't get on that list. You're not someone who automatically gets a ballot. But most importantly, what Clint has said that is just not correct is this. When you think about, gosh, it's going to limit us to 2 candidates, today we have 1. In most of these districts, in 26 out of 30 districts, there's 1 candidate that you get to vote for in the general election. The top 2 is to try and ensure that you have at least 2 people that have to compete when that general election comes up, which does not happen today in those gerrymandered districts.
Mr. Bolick, does what this does for independents attract you at all? What's the problem there?
I'm an independent. I've voted in every primary since I moved to Arizona. I get an early ballot. I don't see it as a problem at all. What I'm most interested in is not voting in some gigantic primary where the top 2 candidates may receive only 15 or 20% of the vote. I'm interested in having competition in the general election, and it's simply not true. Go to your November ballot and you'll see in most instances often 2, 3, 4, 5 candidates. For governor this next time up, we may have 2 Democratic candidates appearing on the ballot and not a single Republican, or vice versa. If you get a lot, and just to give you a concrete example, in the congressional district in which Vernon Parker is running against Kyrsten Sinema, a clear choice between a Republican, Democrat. We would have, if we had had this system in place, we would have 2 liberal Democrats, Shapira versus Sinema. That would be no choice at all. Same thing in another congressional district where we'd have 2 Republicans, Quayle versus Schweikert. That's no choice at all. That really does subvert democracy, and it hurts independents who bounce around in their voting patterns most of all.
No choice at all, Mr. Johnson, in districts that are heavily one party or another? How does this allay that?
2 things. For Clint to be correct, you have to assume that all the voters would have voted identically if they'd have had choices. I can promise you there are Democrats that would have crossed over and voted for Republicans, Republicans that would have crossed over to vote for Democrats. Second, there'd be more independents voting because they'd now be on the automatic early ballot list, which is very different than requesting an early ballot. It's meaning you're automatically on it and you get into the system. It also assumes that candidates will campaign exactly like they campaigned. They won't. We know that they will begin to cross over. But I will agree with Clint on this. You will have some districts where there will be 2 Democrats or 2 Republicans. I don't think that's a bad thing. What then happens? The Democrat that has the best chance is the one that can appeal to Republicans and independents as well as some of the Democratic base. The Republican that will have the best chance is the one that does the other. If your mindset is so locked into this red team and blue team, you're not going to like the system. But if you can break beyond that, if you can begin to understand the value that comes to voters in being able to have choices, regardless of how they're registered, and recognize that by doing that you create a different type of candidates that look for ways to cross over, this system provides huge advantages. And in my particular example, I was mayor. I was mayor in a nonpartisan system. I was also a council person. I was a Democrat at the time. I ran in almost a 3-to-1 Republican district. I won that Republican district. How I won it was I talked to those Republicans. I knocked on their doors. And more importantly, they had an effect on how I thought. When I heard them and understood their pain and understood the issues that they were going through, it had an effect on how I saw the world philosophically.
Mr.
Michael,
Bolick.
I want to correct a point that you made earlier. It's not 2 Democrats in a heavily Democratic district. It's 2 Democrats in a district that has more Republicans than Democrats. And the reason that that happens is that there were 7 Republican candidates in the primary and only 3 Democrats. The Republicans split the Republican vote, and so you ended up having 2 Democrats in a district that has a Republican edge in registration. That's not an unusual circumstance at all. When you think about it, of course in a Republican-leaning district, you're going to get more Republican candidates, but you'll get the perverse result that in the general election, which is where you're actually choosing the person to represent you, you only get a choice of 2 Democrats or 2 Republicans. That has happened in 1 out of every 5 campaigns in California. And the system is ripe for manipulation, where you get party bosses saying, you know what, we can't afford to split the vote. Only one of you is going to run. This is going to actually increase the power of political parties in a way that deprives people of a genuine choice in November. That is a really horrible thing. When people vote on this initiative, the campaign understandably is focusing on this wonderfully open primary. It's the general election in which we're limited to only 2 choices, sometimes 2 candidates from the very same party. That's a really scary idea. And if people recognize that, they're going to vote no.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the underlying issues, and one of those, Mr. Johnson, is a statement from the proponents of this that more moderation is needed in state politics. How does this drive that?
Well, first, I would tell you that I'm not against extremes having a voice. I just think that their voice ought to be proportional to their numbers. How this drives it is the same way that it drives it in city council races. When a candidate knows that they're going to have to go campaign with people who are from the other party and with independents, they tend to go meet with them. They listen to them. Candidates are a product of who they talk to. And if the only people they're talking to are the people who vote in a Democratic primary, you can bet they will be more liberal than the average person. If the only person they're speaking to are people who vote in a Republican primary, you can bet they'll be more extreme on the conservative side than their general brethren. But if they have to go talk to everyone, if that takes place, you change the way those candidates look at it. And that's why councils tend to be dramatically more, they work with one another, they work across party lines, because the party just plays a significantly lower role. And if the party was going to play a bigger role in the system that we're advocating, then I would just question, why isn't that happening at the local government level? The answer is, it won't. And what the parties will have to do to be successful is they're going to have to reach out to those independent voters. It may make parties stronger. Here's how. By making them recognize that they cannot continue to appeal just to a very narrow base on each side.
Mr. Bolick, Arizona is known as a conservative state. You've written about this in relation to the notion that the system works because the political system here reflects that conservatism. How does this change that, and is that a good thing?
Well, I do think this is one of the rare initiatives where the framers of the initiative are admitting that they are doing this because they want to induce a particular political outcome. That is very contrary to notions of American democracy, where we let the chips fall where they may and where we let voters express themselves. If they want to elect a conservative or a liberal legislature, there is no manipulation of the system. This system is jerry-rigged to try to produce an outcome where the supposedly more centrist candidate wins, because the idea is that in November you have 2 candidates and the more moderate one will be able to appeal to more voters. I think that deprives voters of the opportunity to express themselves. If they don't like the president, they elect a legislature or members of Congress who are opposed to that president's agenda, that sort of thing. You just may not see that anymore. But what I'm more concerned about is the kind of system where you only get 2 candidates in November and neither of the candidates may be reflective of the philosophy of the people that they are going to represent. That, to me, is a terrifying thought.
Mr. Johnson, make the case that Arizona is a moderate state rather than a conservative one, and thus this system works for it.
Well, to begin with, to start with the rigged system, the existing system is rigged. Most members of the public know they end up having these people who are selected in these two primaries that are extremes, and most members of the public think they have to pick between the lesser of two evils. You hear that a lot. Well, what happens is after they win these primaries and they have no general election, they then move on to a legislature where they then break again into parties. When they break again into parties, the guy or the group that's the majority, they get to make all the rules. They get to determine who the leadership is, what the agenda is going to be. They decide things in closed caucuses. They do it in hotel rooms where the media can't get there, where the public can't hear what they're doing, where members of the other party have no voice, where independents are shut out. This system's been so corrupt for so long that I don't even think we recognize it. It's a system that's driven by insiders. It is driven by a rigged system that helps a certain outcome. The public is not looking for, we use the word moderate. What the public's looking for is that more people have a voice. And if more people have a voice, I believe that's better. More importantly, if the public has choices, real choices, that they can choose in a primary, and then the top two getting to the top level so they can choose between the best of them, it will tend to have a reflection that looks more like the general public. And that's really our goal. We're not trying to drive an ideological point of view. What we're trying to drive is to make certain that whatever it is, it reflects what we have in the general public.
Mr. Bolick, the League of Women Voters, a pretty credible and somewhat independent organization, is against Proposition 121, as you are. But the League does say that change is needed in the system, and you at the very beginning said that the current system isn't all that good. What would you look for in change to improve our electoral system?
Well, it's like Winston Churchill described democracy as the worst possible system except for all of the alternatives. I would love to see an end to gerrymandered districts, and we are at the Goldwater Institute fighting to remove the pressures for gerrymandering. I'd love to see the system of subsidies of political parties go away. But the last thing I think we need is a system where if you can imagine having our next election for governor and having a choice between only two Republicans or two Democrats, that's what this is going to produce. And it's going to produce more backroom deals. When Mr. Johnson talks about local government, look at the turnout in local elections. 30%, 20%, heavily dominated by special interest groups. That's not the future I'd like to see for statewide elections, for congressional elections. Simply too important to risk a system that we know is going to limit choices by definition to only two candidates in November.
Mr. Johnson, the League of Women Voters is against Proposition 121, saying that when you get to the general election level, it disenfranchises independents and minor party candidates. Your response?
I love the League of Women Voters. They're a good group of folks. What they're saying is we didn't go far enough. They want this fair voting, proportional voting. I can guarantee them this. Their partners in our opposition will be much more opposed to that concept than to the one that we put forward. The League recognizes that this has become an insider system that is driven by a very low portion of people who turn out in primaries with no real choices for people in the general election. All the things we say they agree with. They then just say, gosh, we think it would have been better if you'd have done proportional voting. In terms of it providing less choices, again, here's what I can say. Today you have a choice of one person in most elections. In ours, you'll have a choice in every single race between two. And in the primary election, you can vote for any candidate you want. Republican, Democrat, Independent, Green Party candidate. All of them have to run against one another. The top two vote getters go to the next level. It is a system that's very open. If you went back to city governments and looked at them, they do have a lower turnout because they're in odd years. We're not going to have a low turnout in these elections because they're going to be in presidential and gubernatorial election years. What it will do, though, is it gives them more choices and gives them a system where more people can participate.
Your response to that, Mr. Bolick?
The League of Women Voters has a very important point. This will wipe out third parties. this is one of the few issues in which libertarians and Greens emphatically agree. It will kill them. And that is because only the two top vote getters progress. In California this year in the primary, how many campaigns, how many incumbents went to the general election, finished in the top two? Every single one of them. This is a system for insiders. It's a system that wipes out independent parties. And that is not American democracy.
If that's true, I don't know why every single insider in the state seems to be opposing this measure. It is overwhelmingly opposed by almost every incumbent, by most of the lobbyists, and by the two parties. I would also tell you that in terms of this helping promote an insider mentality, you just couldn't be any more insider than we have in this existing system today. But if you believe that the only thing that we should be concerned about is how do you get a majority or how to keep a majority, which are what the parties really are concerned about at the end of the day. If the thing that you believe is that you like the two-party system, and I might add, on Libertarians and Green Party candidates, not one has ever made it, has ever been elected in the state. So I don't know if this is going to be good for them or bad for them. I think it's good for them, but it can't be any worse because the existing system, none of them get elected. But again, back to the issue of the insider system, I'd only say if that's true, I just don't know why every single insider seems to be opposed to what we're doing.
Why is that, Mr. Bolick?
I don't think that that's true. I think that Mr. Johnson, having served as mayor of Phoenix, and the others who are behind this are insiders. They're people who want a particular type of outcome. They want a particular type of centrist legislature, and that's what this is designed to do. This is really not as much about candidates or parties as it is about voters. And basically, if you are a voter and you have ever voted for a third-party candidate, you're going to lose that right with this initiative if it passes.
Clint Bolick, Vice President for Litigation of the Goldwater Institute. Paul Johnson, former Mayor of Phoenix and Chair of the Open Government Committee. Thanks so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Clint.
More information on Proposition 121 is on our website, azweek.com, including our full unedited interview with David Berman. That's our program for Friday, September 21st, 2012. Next Friday, a report on the economic and financial implications of extending Medicaid benefits in Arizona under the Affordable Care Act. For Arizona Week, I'm Michael Cheha.
Production of Arizona Week is made possible in parts by a grant from the Stonewall Foundation and by the members of Arizona Public Media. Thank you for your continued support.